Welcome to another episode of Off-Road Legends. I'm Michael Van Runkle here for Hot Cars, and today we're going to be discussing a seriously hilarious build called Snortin Norton. Now, despite what you might have seen on Mad Max, muscle cars typically don't make the best off-roaders, but this Chevy Nova was built up in the early 80s to compete in Baja's Group 6 sort of open class with very little restriction. It's got a fire-breathing 350 Ci V8. It's got all the suspension in the world. It's gutted, it's caged, and somehow they were hoping that it would at least survive Baja. But in the end, maybe about 30 years later, Snortin Norton would return to Baja and actually score a class win. So let's get into the build, because you obviously need to modify a Chevy Nova by a lot to enter it in Baja. Snortin Norton was built up by owner Mike Newton and named after a screen printing shop. Along with his friend Larry Tunnell, they sort of engaged in fantasies of imagination because there was so little regulation in Group 6. So they dropped in that Chevy 350 built by Dale Speed and Marine, and legend has it that it could run on Azunia Anejo Tequila. Now today, tequila might be cheaper than gasoline, but back in the 80s it was probably even a little easier to find than gasoline in the remote stretches of the Baja 1000. That big V8 had a Holley 750 carburetor on it, Pro Comp aluminum heads, an MSD ignition, and whether or not it could run on tequila, it managed to get them through racing down in Baja. Backing up the power plant was a matching Chevy 350 turbo trans with a Dana 60 rear end. Now you may be wondering, hold on a second, it didn't have four-wheel drive? Well, actually, 4x4s don't do so well in Baja, and only once in over 50 years has a four-wheel drive truck won Baja outright. That was Rod Hall in a Bronco the very first year of Baja. So, the suspension, four-wheel disc brakes, 35-inch tires all allowed Snortin Norton, basically a lifted muscle car, to compete against prepped trucks, Jeeps, dune buggies, Baja bugs, and motorcycles. It also ran in the Mint 400 and the Parker 400 before Newton sadly passed away, and the car ended up somehow sold to a family friend in Louisiana where it was competing in mud racing, which is sort of like a Golden Gloves boxer dropping down into bare-knuckle brawls. It was a shame, and eventually it would have to get rescued from the rust of the humid South. Snortin Norton's savior arrived in the form of another veteran off-road racer, Rick Hurricane Johnson, who traveled to Louisiana to pick up the car, along with builders Matt Shrek Dowland and Ed Hurricane Dowland. Johnson set about prepping Snortin Norton to return to the Nora 1000 in Baja in the early 2010s. They spent about 90 days and hundreds of man-hours upgrading everything that had made this Chevy Nova such a capable Baja racers about 30 years earlier. So they threw in 5 Fox racing shocks at each front wheel, independent coil springs, and at the back they added 4 Fox racing shocks per wheel and Deaver leaf springs to help gobble up that dirt, because speeds had obviously increased in the interim decades. Snortin Norton made its glorious return to Nora in 2011 and managed to take home a vintage class win. It raced again in 2012 and 2013 before Johnson decided to sell the Nova once more and listed it at the astounding price of $30,000. We're talking about a fully prepped racer, documented history, a class win in the vintage race. It's fully ready to go. It's got a cage, it's got buckets and harnesses, it's got window nets, it's got a radio system and GPS. 30 grand sounds like one hell of a deal. But to truly understand why Snortin Norton could only be worth $30,000, we need to sort of understand the history of the Chevy Nova, which these days is really used more often for sort of pro street builds with like huge supercharged V8s, like this 900 horsepower supercharged LS3 Nova that currently runs around LA. Or this famous 66 Nova SS dragster currently making the rounds on the circuit right now with 1,100 horses. Those all sound fine and dandy, but back in the 60s, Chevy originally introduced the Nova nameplate to serve as America's favorite economy car.
It'll cost you more to buy than last year's Nova, but it could cost you less to maintain.
It wasn't even its own model. It was a response to the Ford Falcon and merely just the top trim level on the Chevy 2 economy car.
And no more exciting way to see it than in the new Chevy 2 from Chevrolet.
Average pricing for a Nova in 1966 was $2,471. That's about 66% of the price of the average car purchased in America in 1966. So we're talking about comparing like a BMW 4 Series today to a Toyota Camry or Honda Accord. It was really intended to be an economy car. In '68, Chevy redesigned the Nova with some of the muscle car styling that would show up for Snortin Norton in '71. It also received a stretched wheelbase at 111 inches, which may explain why by the 1980s, Mike Newton decided, hey, let's turn this long wheelbase economy car with some muscle car styling into a Baja racer, because you want that little bit of longer wheelbase to stay steady in the higher speeds of desert racing. The whole concept of converting a Chevy Nova into a Baja racer and then watching it have success over the span of decades is pretty incredible. And even though it never took home what we would consider like a mind-blowing Baja overall win, it still managed that 2011 vintage class win and definitely stands out from the crowd whenever it hits the dirt. I actually first learned about Snortin Norton when I walked by it in the Peterson Museum and saw this ridiculous muscle car. At first I thought it was a Camaro because it's so modified, sitting there among famous Baja racers like a Bronco and a Ford Power Wagon, which I don't think raced in Baja. I walked over and checked it out and was like, this is absolutely insane. Is this a Mad Max replica? Is this something that showed up in a movie once upon a time? But instead, I got to learn all about Snortin Norton, and I hope you did too, watching this latest episode of Off-Road Legends here on Hot Cars. Let us know in the comments if there are any other off-road legends that you want to learn a little bit more about. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and please, as always, before you sign off, like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. Thanks.